Let's continue this topic with our guest. Joining us live is Liudmyla Pokrovshchuk, PhD, an expert in foreign and domestic policy. Liudmyla, good morning and glory to Ukraine.
Hello, glory to the heroes.
So, Liudmyla, we see that essentially, yes, Zelensky put Putin in front of such a choice with this letter. And, it seems like Putin has backed himself into a diplomatic corner. So, how might the situation develop from here? Can Putin continue to use his tried and true tactic, where he drags things out and basically just maintains the appearance of negotiations? Like people are meeting with each other, some advisors are maybe talking. It looks like some kind of preparation is happening, but there are just no results over and over again.
Honestly, we didn't expect anything different from Putin because, well, he said more than once that he doesn't want to meet with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. And basically, he'll only agree to meet, and he confirmed this again at the Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, only after some working groups come up with something. And then, as he says, I'll come and sign something there. And even before that, he also had a meeting with journalists where he said, when they come up with something, of course I can come and sign it, but we need to understand what exactly we're signing. And again, he repeats that the territory of Donbass must be, liberated and all that stuff. Well, basically, we didn't hear anything new. Before the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, everyone was wondering, so what is he going to announce there? And honestly, maybe there would be some different statements there. And after that letter, people were also thinking, well, there still has to be some kind of response. Because even Russians themselves are starting to pick up on the information that there really are problems in Russia. Not just economic problems, but now among the Russian population, people are starting to take off their rose colored glasses a bit. There's a certain unrest, dissatisfaction, and even questions for Putin about what exactly is going on. And it's no coincidence that even journalists have started asking him uncomfortable questions. By the way, this wasn't at the forum in St. Petersburg. It happened in Astana, where he was even asked about his falling approval ratings, how he feels about that, and about the difficult economic situation in Russia. By the way, he didn't say anything about that. He completely dodged the question. Basically, that's why we didn't hear anything new. Just like we said before, we weren't gonna hear anything. Putin will stick to his guns. He'll try to keep up appearances. Even though, of course, the situation is tough, and I think his inner circle understands that perfectly well. And most likely, what they're trying to do now is to come up with some kind of new format, a negotiation format. And as you rightly pointed out, Putin really is stalling for time, watching how the situation develops, because he thinks he's got that time. Although it's worth noting, when you think you have time, especially in Russia, it often turns out you don't have that time at all. And then everything happens very quickly. That's when you see a change of power in Russia, too. Well, history has shown this more than once, how quickly things can change there when people become deeply disappointed in their czar, especially if the czar is leading them in the wrong direction. And that already causes them a lot of damage. And considering that, today, Ukraine is ramping up our long range sanctions against Russia. Of course, when the war comes to your doorstep, you start to wonder, how long is this going to last? And nobody ever told us anything about that. And now Putin will have to give those answers, especially to the people who can't be ignored because they have elections coming up. No matter what anyone says about it being a dictatorship over there, we all understand perfectly well that the elections will be tightly controlled and the numbers will be made up as needed. But even so, this situation still triggers him because, like I said, people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions, really uncomfortable questions. Questions he can't answer. And the people of Russia pick up on this perfectly well and can clearly see that the questions they want answered are not being answered. That's why Putin's inner circle, I think, seeing and understanding all this, so that, like we say, so that this bubbling pressure doesn't blow up in their own faces, they're really starting to think about a kind of a reformatting, maybe, of the negotiation process. This is what we were talking about. that right now, over just the past month, there's really been this idea floating around that there are some behind the scenes talks going on. And we're not just talking about Russia here. Europeans and Americans are involved too. And there are certain conversations, not agreements, but conversations, diplomatic discussions about the need to restart the negotiation track. This is basically what we pointed out in the letter to Putin from Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, that only a diplomatic solution now is finally the time to bring all of this to an end. And now everyone is thinking about what exactly that diplomatic path should look like. Because what happened before those negotiation tracks, well, let's remember the Minsk agreements, what did they actually lead to? They only froze the issue. Then there was another full scale invasion in 2022. And after that, there were attempts to restart negotiations in Istanbul, which were then put on hold in 2025. In 2026, we also tried to resume the negotiation process. Well, you see, Ukraine is always trying to talk and to restart, to somehow come up with ways to really resolve the issue of the Russian Ukrainian war through diplomatic means. That still, we always see that the problem is on Russia's side. It's always Putin who, for some reason, when we say we'll come back, tries to stall for time. That's why now, most likely, the conversation is about not really giving him the chance to stall for time. At the same time, as I said before, let me point out again the people around the Kremlin understand perfectly well that there's really no time left to stall because, well, the window of opportunity that everyone talks about is definitely closing. And the fact that he constantly presents wishful thinking as reality, those so called victories at the front, shows this. Although we understand perfectly well that even the Institute for the Study of War says the exact opposite, that in principle, the initiative is now on Ukraine's side. And of course, when the initiative right now, both in terms of long range sanctions and on the front lines, is entirely on Ukraine's side, we understand that Russia doesn't want to enter negotiations from a weak position. Because whatever happens on the front, anything related to this military component always strengthens the negotiating position of the parties coming to the table. And right now, as many people note, Ukraine has a strong position in this regard. But of course, Russia and Putin in particular won't enter negotiations from such a position, which is why he's trying to buy time. Still, let me point out once again that his inner circle is trying to feel out what kind of reformatting is possible. What kind of format could somehow pave the way for Putin to later present it as some sort of victory when they enter this negotiation track? And of course, it's very important who will be involved in this negotiation process. Because it's clear that we're talking about the United States and the Europeans, and obviously us and Russia. But nevertheless, we understand perfectly well how Russia is trying to push the Europeans into a separate track. In other words, to establish a separate negotiation process with them that doesn't concern the issue of the Russia Ukraine war, but is just about restoring relations with the Europeans. Of course, there's also the question about China, because right now, what we're hearing from the White House administration is that Trump reached out to Xi Jinping, and it's unclear to what extent China will be involved. Although, of course, we would really like China to be present as well, because that would serve as a kind of guarantee that Russia will actually sit at the negotiating table and won't just drag things out or later put everything on hold, leaving it all in limbo again for an indefinite period. Although, let me point out again, they can no longer talk about indefinite timelines or about dragging things out because many people are saying that 2026 is going to be the decisive year. First of all, let's not forget about the elections in the United States. That's something the Kremlin is very sensitive to. They also have their own elections coming out there. But let me point out, their elections are in September, while the ones in the United States are in November. And let's not forget, there will be a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump, which will take place in September as well, where this whole question of what do we do next will also be discussed. Of course, and I think that Putin will probably have to urgently go to China again to negotiate something and make some promises. Although, according to many economists, there's really nothing left to promise because the dependence on the Union on China is already so great that basically, aside from nuclear technologies, Although I'd point out that most likely those nuclear technologies have already been promised long ago, and the process of working together with China on them has been underway for quite some time. That's why, of course, Putin is nervous, and it was noticeable. It was especially obvious in Astana, and when that economic forum was held in St. Petersburg, it was really noticeable. Not so much when he was speaking on those panels, but when he was talking to journalists. You could hear the fatigue in his voice from the questions he was being asked. And this nervousness, because you could still sense his confusion about how to respond. And every time he tried to say the same thing, it was like the same old broken record. But this broken record of his, I'll point out again, definitely doesn't work for an external audience. How well does it still work for the internal audience today? But like I said, if everything were really fine, he wouldn't be this nervous, and his inner circle wouldn't be trying to start negotiations and look for those negotiation points they'd obviously like to reopen.
But on the other hand, Ludmila, right now, obviously, the Russian Federation is attacking Ukraine, trying to occupy Ukrainian territories. But this time isn't working in Putin's favor either, because he's losing personnel. Today, we announced the updated report from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Now, the fact that Russian losses have been exceeding 1,000 per day is already the norm. It's become standard. Earlier, the General Staff also said that the monthly trend of eliminating Russian occupiers actually exceeds their mobilization resources. Fewer are being mobilized, while Ukraine's defense forces are eliminating more Russian occupiers. This is also a trend that has continued for the fourth, or if I'm not mistaken, the fifth month in a row. Does Putin really not care about this? Doesn't he care about Ukraine's long range sanctions either? Considering that after the attack on St. Petersburg, Putin personally commented on it and said, yes, we need to strengthen our air defense. So, in fact, he admitted that the so called second strongest army in the world has problems in the fifth year of the so called special military operation.
Well, he couldn't not admit it because it was just too obvious. He couldn't keep insisting it didn't happen. Of course, he had to admit something. By the way, it's worth noting that's not the only thing he admitted. There was something really interesting. Remember when they'd say, no, no, we didn't strike the occupied territory. There was no attack at all. It wasn't us. By the way, he admitted that it was them. Just to mention, when they claim that Ukraine is to blame for everything, right? And that it's Ukraine striking the occupied territories and all that, well, here's the truth. And when we say that we actually have nothing to do with it, that it's always Russia making things up, spreading fakes, and waging this information war, that moment was really telling when he admitted that the strike on the occupied territory back then was actually carried out by Russia. What you're saying is true. We've said before that he doesn't care how many of those Russians die. The only thing is, what's different now? What happened back in 25, 24, 23, right? Those meat grinder assault side. So what's the difference with 26? Because, as you rightly said, our long range sanctions have started to reveal the reality that the so called second army in the world, this powerful country Russia, can't even defend itself. And this letter from Zelensky, it's basically addressed to Russians too, where he describes the real situation because there's so much white noise. And we're also talking about this information iron curtain that's been put up in Russia. It's definitely hard to break through, but I think this letter was discussed in a lot of Russian kitchens and showed the real situation, what's actually happening. In this reality, yeah, it doesn't quite match up with what's actually going on, what Putin kept trying to present all this time. And of course, in 2026, this became very obvious to Russians. That's why he can't carry out a mobilization right now, because in order to do it before the elections, well, he has elections coming up. How would he justify this mobilization? By admitting weakness, that they're losing? That would be seen internally as a sign of weakness and that they really are losing. And then people will start asking questions about what the president of Russia is saying, right? What is their president talking about when everything is supposedly fine, when he keeps saying that they have nothing but victories and are winning every day? So why ramp up mobilization then? That's why, of course, they'll have to come up with some new fake story, some new enemy. And what he might do, of course, and what really raises a lot of questions today, especially among Europeans, is what Russia could come up with if, as you said, and as our military intelligence says, they're having trouble with mobilization. They'll need to justify this ramping up of mobilization, so they'll have to invent some new pretext for the Russian people themselves. And this pretext that they're starting to float now is, of course, that they're beginning to say that Europe is their enemy, that they're passing new legislation. We know perfectly well that some time ago, Putin signed a law that basically says their army can be present wherever the rights of Russians are being infringed. Yes, in various territories, including those of other countries. So, when there's this strong rhetoric directed at Europe, when there are not only certain actions taking place on Belarusian territory, like these nuclear exercises, we need to understand one thing. First, that Putin is stalling for time. And the fact is, they're trying to come up with a justification for ramping up mobilization right now because they really need to intensify it. Let's point out once again 2026 is a very important year for them. They need to ramp up mobilization, first of all, to make a breakthrough in Ukraine, and secondly, to rattle their sabers in Europe and put pressure on the Europeans so that they agree to the negotiations that the Kremlin really wants, especially negotiations where Europe isn't backing Ukraine. As Ushakov himself pointed out just recently, the only reason the issue can't be resolved is because of the Europeans. And this even prevents the Americans from signing that big agreement they would like to have. So, like I said, all we're going to hear from Putin is him putting on a show, claiming that everything is just great on their end. But the only difference, like I said, is that now there are serious doubts among the Russian people themselves. Because when you don't have gasoline, especially in Crimea, we know that right now, the situation with energy resources is really tough, and there's no easy access to them anymore, only by ration cards. Many regions across Russia are also having problems with energy resources. And it's not just about energy resources. They can clearly see what's happening with the economic situation when they go to the store, especially now that mobilization is ramping up. That's why, like I said, there are a lot of questions right now. And now, for the Kremlin, it's not enough to just talk. They'll actually have to provide answers. But even stepping things up is difficult right now because, like I said, there's a lot of unrest brewing. The lid could blow off, and as often happens in Russian history, everything could turn upside down very quickly. That's why Putin is forced, as I said, to act very nervously, which we all saw at that forum, and of course in Astana.
Lyudmila, thank you so much for joining us on the air. Lyudmyla Pokrovshchchuk, PhD, expert in foreign and domestic policy, was with us live.